I'm very excited for today's topic, a timely topic as it's ever been. The topics of staff attrition and retention has been something that's very important for a long time, but as with many other things, was laid very bare over the last 2 years or so. And I think, as with many of these kind of topics, I think it's important to continue the conversation and think, kind of intentionally and purposefully about how we're navigating now that the worst of the pandemic is behind us, but we're still dealing with some of those same issues, and just thinking through what is the future of staffing, especially in residence life, look like as we are gazing upon the horizon. So we will start out though with a brief intro. Our guests will introduce themselves and give the professional background of kind of how they got to be where they are today.
Excited to be joining and talking about this. I'm actually doing some dissertation research on this topic right now. And so I agree, ever timely, especially as we round another corner into our traditional recruitment season. So my name is Kate Gannon-Cullinan. I use she, they pronouns. I am an associate director for residential operations at Louisiana State University and have been here since about 2018. I do all of our professional staff hiring and recruiting, and did all of our student and grad recruiting until about 2 years ago when I got some help, thank goodness, and got an assistant director to take over those chunks. But I've been in the recruiting field in different roles at different universities, I would say for about a decade at this point, in like a formal role. And in the hiring decision maker, I would say probably about 7 or 8 years now. Of that time. So I started out, as a lot of us do, as an RA, and really was orientation that got me deciding that I wanted to do a career in student affairs. I went to a small school, North Central College, outside of Chicago, go Cards, and then kind of took myself over to Washington State University for grad school, bounced over to Virginia at Old Dominion, back up to Chicago, was at Northwestern for a bit, Loyola Chicago, and then head back to Washington State, and now I'm at Louisiana. I just really like moving across the country, I've decided. And so yeah, I've just kind of continued to elevate those strategy and, leaning on some of my woo and communication strengths to do recruitment and really connect with folks in that kind of a way. So.
Well, yeah, and you'd mentioned, and perhaps it's just been inspired by your career thus far, but that you're focusing dissertation research on this kind of topic at hand of I don't know, sort of the most like general sort of summative way to capture it, but just staff wellness and retention, and then why do staff members, particularly in residence life, end up leaving? So just as a sort of the segue, I guess, like what really made you decide like that is what I want to really like dig in deep on, just at a sort of high level?
Well, I mean, because I've been doing recruitment, right, I've seen and I honestly, folks, I think mistakenly attribute this to COVID. I think COVID has exacerbated a lot of issues in our employment structure as a, Western society in general, but in particular, this great resignation that's been happening for years before the pandemic occurred. And so I honestly think parts of it is that we have some natural attrition that we cause, right? A lot of schools, you have to move out to move up. There's a bottleneck at the mid-level. You have, I have 19 like residence coordinator roles and about 8 leadership. So, and that's pretty big for a leadership team actually. But there's not enough for everyone to stay. And a lot of schools, you want to go and get other experience, or they're not pulling you upward. And I kept seeing this even in myself. I transitioned in the middle of the year twice in my roles, in my career, like left, mid-year, not on a traditional cycle, so to speak. And so I thought, wow, if I was having those experiences and I'm seeing my own staff, transition, at any time of the year, right? I think the old adage of you transition on an academic year, that's just really not as common. I mean, it's not uncommon, right? There's still lots of people that do traditional placement exchanges and wait until grad school is over and move. But I think we're seeing an increase, and we have been for, I would say, about 5 or 6 years now, where folks are leaving in the middle of the year. When I started at LSU in 2018, I didn't stop hiring consistently probably until we hit the pandemic, and then everyone kind of froze because they weren't, job stability and all these pieces, and folks were nervous, which happens. But I mean, I was constantly having openings in the middle of the year, the middle of the semester, and not always because folks were like super unhappy. I think it's just the cycle of the academic year being how we hire in housing is fairly unique in the world of HR in general. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of look into that a little bit more. And as I took more and more classes, I was just curious about this phenomenon of these like off cycle, attritions. There's been studies that look at why folks leave or things like that. And I think it's hard to pinpoint. So I'm hoping by trying to look at this very specific phenomena of like a hall director leaving in the middle of an academic year for another hall director job, right? So it's not a move up, which is fairly naturally explained, or not moving out of the field, which there's quite a bit of research, kind of accruing there. But really looking at, I want to stay in the field. I want to stay in the same type of job, but I'm moving from institution to institution in the middle of the year. And what's prompting that, so to speak, untraditional decision, to kind of see if we can really see why folks are leaving jobs more honestly.
Hmm. Well, and I think my brain just thought of an interesting parallel of like, the idea of sort of the value of like focusing in on kind of a more niche aspect of all this where like students kind of navigate something. So if they were to like transfer schools, or it's like I still want to go to college, I might want to even get the same degree, but I want to go somewhere else, and they do it at the end of the fall semester into the spring. And so it's just like you're still, as an institution, and many do need to provide sort of an orientation or sort of welcoming for them as a transfer, but also like they are still new to this entire campus environment in particular. So it is sort of a thing that could sort of be glossed over, whether it's for students or staff or whatever. So I think warranting that focus and exploration, where like I think it has implications for uh, the individual staff member, but also like for both the uh, institution that is losing that person and for the one that's receiving it, of like and sort of the parallel for the staff members of like how are you training that person, how are you sort of backfilling if they leave, and those sort of things. So yeah, we'll we'll get into all of that, I'm sure. But starting kind of with the most broad question on this topic, and you were kind of alluding to it, I think a couple of the reasons. So if you want to expand on those, or add a couple more to the list, but like, why do you think so many kind of entry level professionals leave the field? And especially, we'll dig in with like the timing in particular, but just some of those kind of broader reasons of why someone would, move on.
Yeah, I think when you look at the research that's already done, and some of the kind of continuing research, there's been a couple of articles and research studies done that incorporate COVID-19 kind of as a either, and it's been interesting, right? Because you either see it as this tightening of like, oh goodness, like the world's so uncertain, I need to stay, or I don't, I may be being asked too much, or I'm too frontline, and that's not what I'm looking for, or things like that. When I was recruiting in 2020, we had a lot of folks, and honestly, like literally the day we were told we were closing for 2 weeks at spring break, we had a group of grad students on camp, like undergrads, to be grad assistants on campus. And we're like, okay, so, right. And so we had to, kind of quickly adapt. And folks that I felt really confident that we were going to get decided to stay closer to family because of all this uncertainty, right? And so I think folks were taking less geographic leaps in that time. And a lot of folks froze jobs or closed campuses altogether. And so I think we're still feeling the ripples of that, right? We had this, big graduating, like a normally sized graduating class of grad students, and then not enough positions. And so I think a lot of folks left the field before they even got to really be entry level. They got their master's and there wasn't anything available. I also think that bottleneck I spoke about has been real, right? I mean, I think we've gotten more and more assistant director positions across the field, and some of that's been FLSA work in terms of folks, needing to reconfigure how they manage their campus populations, and honestly, so much of the research comes down to supervision relationships, right? You can have a departmental culture and support that's great, but as a supervisee, my culture rests with how my supervisor treats me, right? I could love the department and every other assistant director, but if I don't have a good relationship with my supervisor, or they're maybe not like a great human, as it turns out, I'm taking that as the departmental culture, a one single human representing that whole experience. Because it's a big experience, especially as an entry level staff member, and I think supervision, which isn't really trained on in graduate programs, which is part of my critique in my dissertation and in many other people's dissertation, right? It's just this learned behavior, right? Like you pick up pieces you like from old bosses and pieces you don't like. And so folks aren't really trained from an academic background perspective to do that work. It's from within, and hopefully those folks within had good stuff and used some theory in there. But it's tricky. That supervision piece is such. I mean, in I did a pilot study in one of my methodology classes, and that came out. I want to say like 60% of it, people who like got really passionate when they were speaking about their supervision experience. Some great, but mostly, right, we're going to remember those core memories are going to be made by maybe the not so great moments, which is unfortunate. And so when folks talk about toxic workplaces or things like that, oftentimes they are referencing a supervisor relationship and not an entire organization. And so, yeah, so we need to figure out how to do that better. And the whole, I think entry level and mid level folks leave the field more because there's no opportunities within, right? If I'm, in my age group now, like I've, family stuff and things like that. And so geographically, I'm a little bit more settled, or I'm not really looking to move across the country a bunch anymore because I don't have built-in housing at the mid-level. And so, and even some entry-level coordinator jobs don't. And if I can't get promoted at my institution, but I don't want to leave the area I'm at, and maybe I'm in a rural area, there's no other schools, I'm forced to leave the field because there's no opportunities for me to move up in this field, particularly maybe in housing versus or student activity or whatever. And sometimes that transferable piece is challenging too, but I think we force a lot of that. And then we look around, we're like, why is everybody leaving? And we're like, well, there was nowhere for them to go. So they had to go out to move up or to, move off campus or get more money for what what they need to survive. And so I think we cause a lot of it as a profession, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's an important point that you made, like, about the supervisor relationship being so crucial, because they're kind of the tip of the spear, when it comes to like experiencing, uh, workplace culture, and that's sort of just a given anywhere. Um, but I was having a conversation with somebody, and I think they were kind of like, there's three core areas of sort of like your work satisfaction, and that's going to be like a huge sort of like anchor for it, is that supervisor relationship. And uh, the other parts of it being, uh, the overall sort of mission, how much does that resonate with you and your team. But like you said, the supervisor is going to shape so much of the team environment and the mission and everything, because they're kind of dictating like what you do or don't do, or sort of those sort of pieces. So that is like a huge piece. And I think like there should be more of an emphasis put on, just helping people be good managers. I think that, and that's something else too. We're just generally like, it's just not emphasized as much as it could or should be. So and it's kind of one of those things where like, a residence life staff member, like you're not experiencing something that's like unlike anything else in the world. Like it can maybe be sort of like affirming, where it's like, this is something that everybody deals with to an extent. Um, so Right. Yeah. Yeah. Just, yeah. All those sort of like culture experiences and all that. So it's like, learning how to navigate those things. It's like, yes, you'll be well served by that experience wherever you go. But um, so one thing, that you had mentioned, obviously, was like a kind of a really interesting aspect of this, obviously, is the timing, where I think we've just experienced that much many more disruptions to people not just like leaving when the new fiscal year comes in, like people starting in July in anticipation of the new academic year, those sort of things. So there's mid-year changes, or even just like maybe middle of the semester changes or something, and all that. So zeroing in on that, like, talking more about that timing and those disruptions, and like what is the impact of all of that on teams and students, and all the above.
Yeah. Well, and the timing, it's so unique. And I honestly even would say it's fairly unique to housing versus other roles. Not every other unit in a student affairs, piece, but housing specifically, right? We manage the opening and the closing, right? And so it's a very cyclical, like we follow the academic calendar much more, I think, strictly in terms of hiring and things like that. When we think of even RA hiring, right? We want to have everybody hired before we leave for the end of the spring semester so that, folks know to come back. It's very much follows that. And one of my committee members for my dissertation is in our leadership and human resource development program, right? So he's not a student affairs guy. He's purely HR. And when I was talking about this off cycle, he's like, that's just not a thing you'll find in any literature for HR, because there's not like a set, here's when we recruit, right? You're just always recruiting when you have openings. He's like, so it's super fascinating to hear that there's this like very traditional cycle of hiring, in particular for higher ed. And especially housing, I think. And so now, of course, a lot of us will get folks because of this pipeline of grad students, right? It follows the academic cycle. It's very tied in with the student experience. So everything is very mirrored upward, right? Students are admitted at a semester, we hire at a semester, we start, train and all that stuff, right? That's very in tune with that. But I think when that timing gets thrown off or someone leaves mid-year, right, it's a change management for the students, the student staff in particular. If you have a pro and a grad running a building together, there's that like supervisory dynamic. The assistant director that's supervising has to kind of step in and figure out. And for myself, like I'm constantly like, okay, if this happens, then here's our backup here. And here's how we're going to manage this building. And so, the impact, can be pretty intense in terms of if folks really bonded with that staff member, or if it can also be really great if that staff member maybe wasn't great, right? You get how they were checked out or whatever the case is. Maybe it's a chance for a new start, a new kind of affinity building for that community. So, it can have positive and negative simultaneously, right? But it's still a disruption in the operation of the unit. And so, which, it happens, right? It happens. And it's not certainly something that's unique to housing and higher ed. That happens. And so, but I think there's still, I talk about generational differences in some of my research as well. And there's still, some more traditional generations that will, tout loyalty or, don't you care about the student, things like that. It's like, yeah, but it's still a job, right? And so you can't pick and choose when you use that phrase of like, yes, this is a job. Versus a calling, and it could be a calling, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have control over how you roll through that calling. And so so I think having left middle of the year twice in my own career, I felt bad like leaving the students. And a close friend of mine was like, well, they're not going to stay enrolled here for you. So if they're not going to take on an extra major and stay like another 3 years at the university, for you. So like, if you need to do what you need to do, like you can still maintain those relationships in an appropriate way. But, and that was kind of like a good check for me of like, yeah, you're right. Like if I'm unhappy here or there's this other great opportunity closer to where I want to be, like I need to kind of take that. And so,
Mhm. Well, because it made me think like that the loyalty piece or anything like that. Like, you know, it's because I think it's like the notion if it's like, oh, you're like abandoning your post, you're going AWOL or something, and it's like, okay, let's like relax, yeah. But uh, yeah, because I think that aspect of it is like what is slightly unique is that it's one of the sort of industry, housing residence life for college where like uh it is like 24 7, in a sense where like the buildings always need to have someone who is overseeing them and those sort of things. So like, students are there and it's just an, all day, every day sort of thing. So it's like, well, yeah, we need somebody who is responsible for, doing any of the things that need to be done with that facility. And so that's where like, yeah, you have to kind of have people come in on an interim basis and all that. Um and what's, yeah, again, part of the unique part of it is that like institutions sometimes will like hold hiring for that opening because they're so beholden to whether it's like explicit or just sort of implicit of the cyclical hiring site where it's like, oh, we got to wait until the next window because we're just going to like hire all the coordinators at once that we need to versus like doing each one as they come up because we don't have the bandwidth or sort of the infrastructure to facilitate that. So it's kind of like I guess sometimes like a worst of both worlds where it's like, well, the stuff's not stopping, so we need somebody to do it, but we can't get somebody who's like permanently dedicated to it because we are hiring on, that cycle. So, um, Yeah, there's definitely those impacts there. But yeah, then a good point too that there can be positive impacts if uh, somebody was sort of overstaying their welcome in that position. So um, yeah, and I guess the next thing I think that could be kind of a big topic of this the next thing that could be a good, kind of discussion point for this is, what can be done from a recruitment perspective, whether it is sort of just like, systematically, breaking apart from those hiring cycles or, yeah, on like the training onboarding thing or whatever else comes to mind, like what can be done from a recruitment perspective to try to, help smooth all of this over.
It's really about honesty and having that personal connection with folks. I made during COVID year, when everything went virtual, we were like, okay, we'll stay on the same timeline, that TPE normally would be, right? We'll just wait for our interviews to happen in the middle of March. And then I found that we were just really behind. Like everyone else had started going. And I'm a competitor. I was an athlete my whole life. So I was like, all right, bet next year we are coming in hot. And so we were starting to make offers at the end of January last year for folks to start. And so I think you have to be thinking that way, right? Like not waiting until spring break to do your interviews like we would normally do. But we'll post, before the winter break so folks can see. We've started, and many other schools, like their grad programs are doing interest and info sessions in October, planning their visit days earlier and earlier just to try to get in front of folks, right? Like to have their name tossed around. And so I think as soon as hey, I know I'm going to have these openings. Some of these might be tentative. Like I start going, right? I get my stuff posted and I'm ready to start doing interviews. And I would say I'm a pretty quick interviewer. Like if you apply, I'm reaching out within 24 hours. And that's part of being not aggressive, but just making sure that folks understand, like you respect and appreciate, like, hey, you took the time to apply. I want to be in contact with you. I think you still hear the horror stories of folks that get ghosted. Like I applied, I heard nothing for 6 months, right? And if I'm a recruiter and I'm like, okay, I know we have a priority deadline for like 3 weeks, so we're not going to do anything. I'm still going to email those folks within 5 days, like, within a, 72-ish hour period of like, thanks so much for your application. Just a heads up, we're going to start interviewing this week. Just so that they know, hey, someone has seen it and like that they're feeling just seen as a human before they've even interviewed. Like those are crucial moments to make those connections with folks. So even if maybe they don't move forward in the position or in the search, they still felt like they had a personal connection with somebody. And more, I think, as folks, as we're rebounding off of everything being virtual, like folks are looking for those personal connections. I think Gen Z in general, wanting to like be noticed and seen and affirmed as like an individual and not just part of some number is super important. And why I think we see even more and more job hops, right? Like especially in housing, you've got this foundation of housing, meal plan, probably some built-in friends because you've got a larger peer group at that professional level. It's easy to job hop. It's easy to move from Miami to California. Relative, you got to pack your stuff, but I mean, it's like transferring schools, like you said, right? Like there's an expectation that there's going to be housing and a meal plan and probably a reserved parking spot, like these perks that are part of the position that make it easier or less unknown, right, to move and try to find housing. And so I think that allows for this type of a role to do that more frequently. And so as a recruiter, you need to stay up on here's what we have to offer. And even if it's not salary, we certainly don't have the highest salary in our, we're trying, right? We don't have the highest salary in our conference, but I try to really have lots of personal moments and making sure that I, as the hiring manager, have time one-on-one with that candidate at the end of the day and try to be really honest. And, if there's something that came up during the day, they said something squirrely, or someone was like, this came off negative, I'm going to bring it up. And that end of the thing, hey, this came off in this way. I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of talk through that some more so that I'm not making a judgment call on this candidate based off of one person's interpretation. I'm allowing them to tell their own story. And even if we don't go with them, I've gotten great feedback. We do some post, on campus surveys with folks that like they've appreciated at least being able to like have that conversation. And so I think you just have to be really honest and open in those conversations as a recruiter. So if folks know what, right. And if this is their vibe or not, then, that's what, right. We call it. Did they pass the vibe check? Like, do we think like they're going to bring what we want? And do we have what they want? Really? Like, I think you have to start thinking about what do we have to offer and not just like, oh, we're slinging out jobs. They should be so grateful. They ain't anymore. I mean, there's so much competition out there. People are opening understaffed everywhere. And so you got to put it on too a little bit more, right? Like you'd be lucky to have them. And so,
Well, yeah, I think that is like just a very clear and actionable and good piece of advice of like take every opportunity you can to like build the relationship through the recruitment process, because like you said, it's gonna serve both sides where like they feel comfortable seeing her in affirmed, and like you feel as though you've maybe uh kind of exhausted all options in terms of just sort of like, hey, we are opening ourselves up here, we're reaching out, and again, like that vibe check was like, oh, they seemed a little reserved or whatever, and like you might get cued into that and try to really prompt them to open up, or if that's the person that you choose to go with and you've taken those opportunities for relationship building, like how better to acclimate them to the team, or supervise them and all those sort of things. But the other point though of like, because you're kind of like checking yourself where it's like, oh, I don't want to be aggressive, that's not what I'm doing. One person's aggressive is like another person's like prioritizing and being efficient and all that. Cause like anytime I've done, been more responsible for searches and stuff, like I do kind of the same thing where I'm like, every day I'm going to block off some time, prioritization, like I'm going to create space in my schedule, knowing that this is a thing that needs to happen, especially like on a given timeline, and be like, yeah, I'm combing through. And on one hand, it's like, it's also refreshing to people to just know, like, not be ghosted, like, no, like, hey, not the right fit right now. Thank you so much. So they're not wondering. And then on the other side, it's like, hey, if this is a great person, let's not let them, sort of just dangle out there for too long, and just let them know, like, we will be reaching out about interviews at the end of the week, or so, like they're getting sort of a context, sort of a timeline as to, how things will progress. But then it could be, again, that relationship building opportunity where, it is a human being reaching out to them, not just like an automated response. And it's like, let me know if you have any questions, and then some people, like I've seen, where they just like, it starts kind of creating a flurry of activity, and it's just great to see, like, wow, you're really engaged and you're really interested, you have some good questions, and like, you're feeling more comfortable, and I know that you are not just sort of like scattershotting, as part of the recipe here of finding a job. But like, I think I've just seen that, like, depending on how searches are conducted, you can just be like so inundated with people that are just like sort of like hitting every single thing that looks good, and not even like kind of scrutinizing of like, wait, where is this? What is this? Like, what's the details and all that? So it's like, okay, if we're sort of trying to engage and you're not following up, then that's sort of telling as well. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely going to be, I think, the name of the game anymore, because uh yeah, like the competitive market, trying to be efficient in prioritizing these things is definitely going to be important.
and you have to too back it up with like how you structure your department. I think you mentioned earlier the 24/7 piece, like that shouldn't be the case, right? Like if you have more than a human managing your campus population, there needs to be, and part of what we've had to do this year, I mean, we had about 50% new this year. We just had a big turnover and a big graduating class. And so, and folks that were just ready for the mid-level and took that shot, right? And so, we're continuing to do some kind of like unbreaking of habits. I'm like, get out of your office. It's 5 o'clock. Go, get out of here. We end at 4:30. And I'm like, go. Like, you're like, well, I'm like, those emails will be there tomorrow. Like, I was like, now you're grown up, right? You're gonna do what you want to do. But I want you to know that as a department, that's not our expectation. And so we're trying to like, because what I don't want to happen is folks have these old habits and they're doing those and they're mistaking that as like, that's what we're expecting as a department. And so I think you have to, and our new director has done a great job of coming in, and we're trying to do some schedules where everyone gets a day to work from home or from wherever every week. And we're trying to make it consistent and equitable and trying to figure out how that works, which is very tricky with 40 pro staff. But trying to, how do you unbreak some of those pieces to make more sustainable careers in the field? Because I think people have this like nightmare, view of a live-in professional always having to be on. And that shouldn't need to be the case. That's what on-call staff is for. And so it's really about kind of unbreaking some of those boundaries of when you're an RA and you think you need to know everything on your floor. I don't expect to know everything that happens in your building overnight because you're not on call. You'll read the IRs the next day, And so and then that's that's ingrained culture in our field, even from us as like millennial supervisors, right? Like that's what I did, but is that how it should be done? Like, is that needed? And I think that's, you can recruit folks, but in terms of retention, we got to start breaking down some of those pieces and looking at other fields for how they're doing that retention piece, and what can we take and implement, and what's going to be more sustainable for us, because it's the same students.
Which I think is kind of like, yeah, like it's kind of a refreshing undercurrent to this conversation is like sort of taking inspiration from sort of like the wider, world of work, and sort of adapting and contouring it to residence life. Because, yeah, I mean, I think that's the same thing where like I would see in certain work environments where people would be bringing their laptops home and do different things where it's just like you can, I mean, one, obviously, like that's part of what it's for, I guess, but like I think the biggest intention was just like, it was it wasn't like a campus-based environment. So like, it was kind of like, oh, it's everybody can kind of like sit down on the couches in the lounge in like this office building, or like go into the meeting rooms and bring the laptops and, put stuff up on the screens, whatever. But I'm like, it started to be where people would see other people doing that. So they did like, but there was never really like outspoken rules about, again, like sort of like, hey, close down. Like, it's fine. There's people on call. That's why they're there. And so, yeah, there's a lot of aspects of sort of making those sort of practices of balance way more explicit, and sort of reaffirming them continually, because I think some people might just sort of like say kind of platitudes but then never sort of follow them up, or they're not role modeling the behavior or anything like that. But um yeah, I mean, I think that's a good cue is like, if you're doing things correctly in all those sort of areas, it's not going to be so 24/7, and you might be able to like get your head above water and be like, well, it also will better serve our team's wellness to backfill that position, to then everybody's sort of more, kind of throttled into the right, sort of, they're not kind of cranked up and overclocked because there's, short staffing and stuff. Because like they might be like, well, like this is like bullet train going like super fast. We can't even stop to try to recruit somebody. It's like, well, if you, maybe try to do some of these things, you'll feel like things kind of settle, and you can give some of the time to, prioritize a search and all that. So, yeah. So yeah, incredible advice. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and everything that you shared. And we'll have ways to connect with you in the show notes for this episode. But yeah, this is great. I love talking about this stuff.
Yes, thank you. I know, really, I could nerd out about it all day. So, thank you so much.